Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content.
Lightning cracks. Deafening thunder accompanying brilliant light splitting across the ominous sky. The rain is pouring, but the crew of the battered wooden ship rushes to their posts, frantically calling out orders. It is the year 985, and a small, open-topped Viking longship is battered by a ferocious storm. The men, women, children, and livestock on board are huddled for what shelter they can find, while the crew struggles with the rigging or wrestles the oars. The Arctic wind is bitterly cold, the journey exhausting and terrifying. Huge waves toss the ship dangerously near unseen hazards, rocks and icebergs, yet still they push on. Still they battle ahead, braving a path through the rain, sleet, and hail, past the frigid Arctic waves that buffet their tiny ship. These people are settlers, colonists looking for a new land, a new home. Their Jarl, the ferocious Viking warrior Erik the Red, has discovered a new land. He's been there. He says it's so beautiful that he has named it Greenland. There, he says, these colonists will find open pastures for their livestock. They can build homes for their families and create an incredible new life together. Another wave pounds against the boat, flooding the deck with the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The skies are evil and foreboding. The wind chill below zero. Some of the colonists begin to wonder, what exactly have we gotten ourselves into? Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here with my co-host, Dr. Pat Larish. And Pat, welcome back. Hi, how are you? Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. It's good to be here. We're having a bit of a winter up here in Boston.
You are.
Yeah.
I was at the beach last weekend, and it was pretty awesome in Brazil here, but it does look cold up north.
Yeah.
So this will be a perfect episode for the winter then, because this episode is going to be cold. It's going to be about stuff that's cold.
Stuff that's cold, but not Antarctica.
Not Antarctica. We are in the Northern Hemisphere. We are going to be talking about, Greenland has been in the news quite a bit recently. And
it has, yes.
Yeah, and the story of Greenland is one that I really enjoy telling. And so while we are here in the winter, everyone is cold, and Greenland is a thing that people are thinking about, which almost never happens.
Except for people who actually live in Greenland.
Except for people who live there, and people from Denmark and other places. But I'm sure somebody is thinking about Greenland all the time. And I am one of those people, because I love the story of the first settlements of Greenland, because they are tied to a Viking warrior named Erik the Red. And there are not a lot of great stories of human exploration that begin with a big red-bearded Viking just wantonly flying off the handle with a crazy temper and killing a bunch of people with an axe. But that is where the story of Greenland begins. And it gets a little weirder and weirder and weirder as it goes. And the story of Erik the Red is one that, like I said, I really enjoy telling, and I am very excited to do an episode on it today. So we're going to talk about the discovery of not just Greenland, but also how Greenland and the people that live there actually were the ones that discovered America to begin with, or at least some of the first Europeans to land in North America as we know it today. So
yes,
this is going to be a fun episode, and I'm excited for it. So we're going to take a really quick commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to tell the story of Erik the Red and the history of Greenland. So I wrote a book at one point about, it's called Guts and Glory of the Vikings. And it was about the history of the Viking people, kind of from the earliest information we have on them up until kind of they eventually settle down and become just kind of Europeans. And the Vikings are very interesting. And one of the most interesting things about working on that book and publishing that book was that we always kind of think of Vikings as being, badass. We think about badass groups of people from history. Oh, you've got the Spartans, you've got the Mongols, you've got the pirates, you've got Vikings. But it's, unlike some of those other groups, there aren't a lot of Vikings that your typical, history buff could name by name, except for perhaps Leif Erikson, who we're going to talk about today. And Leif Erikson is an explorer. He's not the kind of Viking you're thinking about when you think about badass Viking warriors. So
no, I suppose not. Yeah. You might think of Olaf Crowbone.
Yes, we did do Olaf Crowbone, and he is definitely a badass Viking. And if you want to follow up on that episode, that is definitely worth listening to, because Olaf, he's a maniac. So that was a good episode. We're going to talk about a guy who has the temperament of Olaf Crowbone, and that is Erik the Red. Now, Erik the Red's nickname, and the Viking names are always great. Erik the Red's nickname is not particularly clever. It's because he had big red hair and a big red beard. And it has nothing to do with his red hot temper, which we will get into soon enough.
But it could easily have been after his red hot temper too.
Yes, exactly. And so Erik the Red, he first shows up in history around 980 CE. And according to the sagas, and this is one thing that we come across every time we talk about Viking stuff, is that a lot of what we have on them is based on saga, which, especially in the case of this Greenland saga, people had kind of written off for a long time as mythological, because it has, they're talking to gods, and there are very scant details on this, and there is some supernatural stuff that happens in these stories. And so it's that kind of history of Troy thing that we talked about in a previous episode as well, where the mythology gets mixed in with the history enough that in later generations, they were like, this can't be a real story because it's got all of this weird supernatural stuff in it. Only to find out later that archaeological evidence supports some of the things that happened in this story. So
yes,
that's history for you, right?
That is history for you. Yeah. So these sagas, people had dismissed them, but
we have been able to verify a lot of the information in them using carbon-14 data or dating from Viking settlements that we have discovered. So we'll get into it in a little bit, but it gives a little bit of extra credence to where these stories come from. So for Erik the Red, we're looking at the Vinland saga and the Greenland sagas. And so the first time he shows up in history at any point is around 980 CE, where, according to these sagas, Erik and his father have been forced to sail 700 miles from Norway to Iceland after being convicted of, quote, some killings, which I think is
killings.
Just some killings. They did some killings in Norway, and they're not allowed to stay there anymore. Probably family blood feuds, probably Viking stuff, but they were outlawed from returning to Norway. And so Erik is in his 30s. His dad is in his 50s or 60s. They move to Iceland, and they settle down in Iceland. They buy a farm. They raise sheep. Erik gets married to a woman named Fjordhild. And he probably did some Viking raiding, but we're not sure about that. But he does well enough for himself that he has this sheep farm, and he's able to buy nice stuff like gold, jewelry, livestock, and he's able to afford servants. And things are going pretty well for Erik in Iceland for a few years, until one day some of Erik's servants are messing around with something, and they accidentally cause a big landslide that falls onto Erik's neighbor's house. And there's this big avalanche of boulders and dirt, crashes onto the neighbor's house, flattens a portion of his house. The neighbor claws his way out of the rubble, gets upset that these guys dropped a bunch of avalanche on his house. He gets together with his closest friends, and they kill all of those servants with swords and axes.
What?
That's just how Viking neighbors settled their disputes.
Okay. I mean, Couldn't he have, like, I don't know, sued him in court, gotten a law speaker to tell him what the restitution would be, or get the servants to rebuild the thing for him? Okay. So
Yes, those were options for him at the time. There were law speakers. This is not like some completely lawless,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that was not the first thing that came to this neighbor's mind when a bunch of dirt fell on his house and buried the entrance to his house. He clawed his way out of the rubble, killed these servants. Well, Erik the Red is not the kind of person that takes kindly to having his servants murdered. And so
I wouldn't either.
No, for sure. So Erik goes to this guy's house and knocks on the door. When the guy opens it, he kills him with a sword. Yes. Yes. Some killings. The guy's cousin, the dead neighbor's cousin, was a famous Viking warrior named Hrafn the Dueler. And so Hrafn the Dueler does what you'd expect him to do, and he challenges Erik to a duel. Erik accepts the duel and kills Hrafn the Dueler in the duel. Okay, some killings are continuing here. So the dead neighbor's kinsmen, they are still pretty upset that all of their family is being murdered by Erik the Red. And they do what you suggested, Pat. They decide they're not going to try to fight Erik in a battle. They are going to sue him in court with a law speaker.
Yes. Yes, that's the civilized way to do it. Okay.
Yes.
How does that go?
Well, they go to the thing. The thing is like basically Icelandic parliament. It's kind of a democracy. Group of townspeople get together to discuss laws and settle disputes.
And it is literally called the thing.
It's called the thing with a capital T.
Yeah.
And so they present their case. Erik presents his case. In my defense, I was really mad. That doesn't go over well at the thing. And Erik is sentenced to lesser outlawry.
So lesser outlawry, that means that if your sentence is lesser outlawry, you have 3 years to get your butt out of Iceland, and you would not be allowed to return for 3 more years. So it's a sort of exile, but exile with a term limit on it.
Yeah. So that's what happens here. And this is kind of presenting a bit of a problem for Erik because he's already barred from Norway. He was kicked out of Norway for killing some people. He sailed west to Iceland, killed a bunch of people there, and now he doesn't have a lot of options. He can go to Denmark or Sweden, I guess, or to some, like, those are the kind of the Viking areas, and Norway and
Faroe
Iceland.
Islands?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Sweden and Denmark are not on like kind terms with Norway and Iceland at the moment, so he doesn't really want to go there.
Could he dye his hair and beard and pretend to be someone else? Go incognito?
He could, but that's not Erik the Red style. So he's a big self-aggrandizing Viking who responds to the slightest affront with extreme violence. So, to that end, he has 3 years to get his things organized and to leave Iceland. Okay, that seems like, so he gets started working on that. He's trying to figure out where he's going to go. But at some point during that 3 years, there's another neighbor of Erik's named Thorgest. And Thorgest comes over to Erik's house and says, hey, I've got some friends coming over. Can I borrow some bench boards? So picture like a big bench that you would put at your longhouse.
Yeah, and all your buddies can come over, sit around, drink some ale or drink some mead or something. Yeah, okay.
Sure, easy.
Yeah.
So Erik, of course, is a good neighbor. He says, yes, of course you can borrow my bench boards. Have fun, enjoy the party. Thorgest borrows them and he forgets to return them. A couple of months pass. Erik's like, I really would like to have those bench boards back. They are furniture that goes in my house. So he goes to Thorgest's house and he knocks on the door and he has a civilized discussion. Hey, Thorgest. Hi, neighbor. Have you seen those bench boards? You borrowed them and I was kind of hoping I was going to get them back. It's been a couple of months. That's not very neighborly of you. They have a little bit of a conversation. Weapons are drawn. Erik kills Thorgest's 2 adult sons and, quote, certain other men in hand-to-hand combat during this dispute. And Erik finds himself in Thing Court one more time.
Erik, dude.
Erik
Oh,
is
no.
convicted of some more killings. And at the Thing, he does not acquit himself well in his defense. And his sentence is upgraded from lesser outlawry to full outlaw, which sounds like badass, sounds like a gunslinger thing, but full outlaw means you are outside of the law, and that is a bad thing, right, Pat?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, earlier when we mentioned that his earlier conviction was for lesser outlawry does kind of imply the existence of a larger form of outlawry. Yes. So the sentence of full outlaw means that Erik would lose all of his land and property, and he would have to leave the country, in this case Iceland, immediately. He doesn't have a 3-year grace period to get ready and pack his bags. And it was also illegal for any Icelander to help him in any way. And any Icelander who saw him, like, walking down the street or whatever, could just run up and kill him as soon as they see him, and they would not get punished in any way at all. So this is making it a very uncomfortable place for Erik to be.
Yes. He's not allowed to own property. Nobody can help him. And yeah, it's like a personal purge against him because he is now outside of the law. And so anybody who wants to kill him can just kill him, and it's fine. And there's no penalty for this because he's an outlaw.
Yeah.
The two families now, who, remember, were his neighbors, they're pretty excited about this. They start forming a vigilante crew to go deal with Erik the Red. And he decides, okay, I gotta go. So he gets together his family, a couple friends, some servants, some livestock, whatever he can, loads them onto this old ship, and he sails as far away from civilization as he can get. Now, like we said, he's in Iceland now. He's got some options. He can go east towards Denmark or England or mainland Europe, but instead he goes west to an uncharted landmass that had only just been spotted by Vikings for the first time 70 years ago. A place we now know as the glacier-covered island of Greenland. Now, here's the deal with Greenland. Greenland had been kind of accidentally discovered 70 years earlier by a Viking named Gunnbjorn Ulf Kraxen, who found what he described as, quote, a bleak land of ice, end quote. While he was looking for Iceland, he was like sailing for Iceland. He got blown off course. He discovered this bleak land of nothing. And he was like, this is not the bleak land of ice I'm looking for. So he turned around and went back home.
And then 20 years after that, another guy called Snaborn Galti and some colonists tried to settle on one of the frozen islands off the coast of Greenland. They called them Gunnbjorn Skerries. That didn't work out so well. These skerries, Gunnbjorn Skerries, were just so awful and ice-covered and lacking amenities that the colonists just killed each other a few months after they moved there. And we don't really hear anything about them ever again. No one heard from them, and nobody tried to sail near there. And I guess we just don't talk about Gunnbjorn Skerries anymore.
Yeah, you don't want to go to Gunnbjorn Skerries. So Gunnbjorn Ulf Kraxen finds it 70 years before Erik the Red goes there. 20 years after Gunnbjorn, this colony is set up there. They all end up killing each other. This is a thing that we see in Viking culture. The settlement is never heard from again. And so Erik the Red's like, I'll go there. I'll go to a place where there's not going to be any neighbors for me to have disputes with.
Yeah, it seems like Erik and neighbors are not a good fit.
Yes. So he takes this old ship. He sails it for 5 days in the general direction of Gunnbjorn Skerries on the map. He is being hammered by storms. There's ice flows. There's glaciers. They're in the North Atlantic. It's cold. There's high winds and there's big waves. And he is in this like boat that is really not like designed for this. Viking boats are designed for river sailing and like coastal sailing, not this. And especially ones from Iceland.
Yeah, because Icelandic lumber apparently wasn't good for shipbuilding. So all the ships you could get in Iceland are just like secondhand boats that have been built many years earlier in Norway and maybe better suited for rivers rather than seas full of glaciers and ice and storms and whatever. So, yeah. So, earlier, Ben, when you said, oh, yeah, he was just on an old ship, that wasn't just,
It was like for real an old ship. Like
literally an old ship.
Like a used car, right? Like a beat up.
Yeah. And maybe he kicked the tires, but, that wouldn't change anything because that's what he's stuck with. So, yeah.
Right. And nobody can help him. So he can't even buy a new one or get it fixed up.
Yeah.
Okay. So he takes his family and his closest friend and some friends and some livestock and whatever, and he sails 5 days from Iceland to the west to an area that he barely knows where it is, has never been there before, and lands on Greenland, which is a place that mainland Greenland, which is a place that no European had ever set foot on before. He scouts out the east side of Greenland and discovers there's really nothing of value there. It is 90% covered in glaciers. And so on the eastern side, there's not much there. He ventures around the Cape on the southern tip of Greenland, and he finds a few decent spots on the west side that he could use for livestock. So he pulls up. I'm sure his family is super excited about this. They settle down. They unload their stuff. They start to live off the land with just what they brought with them on the boat, which is not much. Erik's a high energy guy. And so Erik, he starts climbing mountains. He sails up and down the inlets. He discovers fjords and forests and pastures. He finds a couple good places that he thinks would work for settlements. He's there for 3 years, and he maps as much of Greenland as he can get to, and finds all these interesting geographic features, and he names all of them after himself. So,
of course.
Yes.
I mean, if you don't have any neighbors,
right. This is Erik's mountain now.
Yeah.
So he lives in Greenland off the land for 3 years with his family. He's fishing for salmon in the fjords. He raises goats and cows. He thinks it's really funny because the animals that live on Greenland have never seen humans before. So they'll just literally walk right up to him because they don't know what he is. He was like, it's so funny. We've got these seals and they just walk right up to you. You just whack them on top of the head and eat them. It's so funny. That's kind of how he describes it. That's how an Erik the Red would describe something like that, I feel.
Yes. Okay, so he's kind of got this kind of golden age going on, just living off the land, bopping animals on the head.
Yep, making coats out of them, all that. So
like you do, yeah.
Yeah, and so in 985, at some point in those 3 years, he is able to get full outlaw downgraded to lesser outlaw. It's not clear how, and it may have involved a trial by combat with Thorgest, the neighbor that borrowed his bench boards, but it's not obvious how this happened. But in 985, Erik the Red is back in Iceland, and it's not legal to kill him.
Okay.
So he returns there, and he's got some stories to tell. Guess what, guys? I discovered an awesome land. It's called Greenland, and it's super green, and there's all this land, and there's great pastures for you. It's awesome. You're going to love it. We should all go there. It's amazing. And there's this great quote by Erik the Red when they were like, I think I might have mentioned this, maybe even in the Christmas one where we talked about Odin and the Wild Hunt, but Iceland is mostly green, and it's called Iceland because in the Old Norse, it's Island. It's just spelled like we say the word island, but they pronounced it hard S. So it's Iceland, Island. Greenland is mostly ice, and it's called Greenland because Erik the Red said something along the lines of people would be more likely to go there if the land has an attractive name.
Yes.
So he shows up and lies to the people of Iceland about this beautiful, lush fantasy land where food is plentiful and so is land, and everybody's going to go there and be happy. And in 985, he convinces 25 ships full of people.
25 entire ships.
25 ships. And they all set sail for Greenland, and they have to do that 5-day journey through the storms and the ice flows and all of that stuff. And of those 25, only 14 make it to Greenland. Most of them turned back. Or the ship was wrecked and the people were saved. Some of those people did not make it. Some of those people died in the journey. But
and some of these people were maybe not hardened sailors. Like, you might have had entire families with children.
Yeah, the colonists. They're colonists coming there to establish a settlement, right?
Yeah.
And most of them just got scared by the journey and by it being cold and windy, and the sailing was hard, and they were finally just like, look, all I'm seeing here is ice. I don't believe, Erik, that this land is going to be awesome. We're going back.
Where's the green? Show us the green.
Yes, where is the green? I can't see it from here. And the colonists finally get there, and they arrive at Erik's Fjord, which is the main settlement on Greenland, which Erik has, of course, named after himself. And they get there and set up a settlement. They probably aren't that excited about it. They probably have the same vibe that Erik's family did when he first landed at Erik's Fjord. But the main settlement ends up being home to like 400 people. And it's the first settlement on Greenland.
Yeah. And a lot of times when we're talking about the Americas and, you hear things like, oh, like the first settlement, the oldest settlement, or whatever, depending, you might have to qualify many of these by saying, oh, the first settlement by Europeans, because, of course, the Americas have been populated by Native Americans for millennia. So I was prepared to maybe dig into your comment, Ben, that, oh, this is the first settlement in Greenland. But it might actually be. We might actually be able to say that this is the first settlement by anyone in Greenland. We do have evidence of people being active on the northern end of Greenland, which is actually really impressive because it's really all the way up there, and not really near any of the settleable areas that Erik found. So from around the year 900 or so, we do have some artifacts from what our anthropologists call the Dorset culture. But these are artifacts, and so they may have just been from nomadic groups, nomadic hunting parties, not really a settlement-oriented culture, at least not the way they do it, not the way they did it in Greenland. So, okay, Dorset culture, cool, but I'm not really crediting them with like an actual settlement with buildings. And then later on, of course, we don't have just the Vikings. We also have the Thule people, who are the ancestors of modern day Inuit. But the Thule people, they're not really showing up in Greenland until around 1200. So I think maybe Erik and his pals get credit for the first settlement.
They might not have been the first people there. Yeah. So the Dorset were there about 80 years before him that we can prove. And he might have had the first like permanent establishments there. Farms and families and stuff. It's interesting that the Vikings on Greenland predate the Inuit, which you wouldn't have expected. But the people of Erik's Fjord, they do pretty well. They hunt reindeer, which is a thing that not a lot of people had seen before. They hunt wild hares, whales, walruses. When the Inuit do show up, they establish trade with between them, as well as between the Norwegians, Iceland, Ireland, England. The main Greenland exports become ivory from walrus tusks and narwhal horns, crafts of whalebone, exotic pelts and furs from creatures that nobody had seen before ever. Creatures like polar bears and Arctic foxes, things that nobody had ever seen before. And the Greenland culture is getting set up here. And Erik the Red, of course, establishes himself as the king or the Jarl of Greenland, because of course he would. I'm in charge here.
Of course he would.
Place named after me.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, he did take the initiative on this endeavor.
He did. This was his plan. But here's the wild thing. I get like real King Conan vibes from Erik, because after he becomes the Jarl of Iceland, he settles down. And doesn't do more, quote, some killings.
Okay.
He has 3 kids. He builds a couple of churches at the request of his wife. According to the sagas, he is, quote, greatly annoyed when she makes him give up the heathen gods and take Catholicism. But he does it, and he builds some churches. He rules over the Greenlanders as a jarl. He solves disputes, and he doesn't, at least as far as we can tell, he doesn't kill anybody else with an axe for the rest of his life. And in fact, like, he does a good job of managing the colony, and people start to want to move there over the next few years.
Hey,
which is
good for him.
Who saw that coming?
Yeah. Seems like he just needed a purpose in life. He needed a focus for his energies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good job. Good job, Erik. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the colony, good job, Erik. It thrived for 4.5 centuries and had over 300 farms, maybe 4,000 or more inhabitants, and all sorts of Catholic religious buildings, a cathedral, a convent, you name it. And it kept going until about 1450. And that's when you may have heard of the Little Ice Age. It was a dramatic climate change in certain parts of the world. And it made the land too cold for livestock, and meant that the people living there, whom I think we can now call Greenlanders, it made the people living there move because the land just wasn't able to support their lives anymore.
Yeah, Greenland wasn't as cold in 1000 AD as it is now, as it was after 1450, and the livestock couldn't survive there, so the settlement had to relocate. The country of Greenland now is populated almost entirely by Inuit, and it's run as a self-governing community under the crown of Denmark. And that's a little bit weird because, Erik the Red was Norwegian via Iceland, but at some point during, not too long after Erik's life, Denmark, and I want to say it's King Svein Forkbeard, but it might be Canute the Great, but Denmark defeats Norway/Iceland in a war and takes over all of their territory, including the settlements in Greenland. So my favorite
that
joke
explains
of
that. Yeah.
Yes, that's why they're Danish, because the Danish defeated took it from Norway and Iceland in a war. The joke that I like to make about Greenland is the flag of Greenland it's a couple circles, and it's red and white, which are the colors of the Danish crown. But the joke that I like to make about Denmark when I do the PowerPoint presentation for Erik the Red is that not even the flag is green. Erik the Red called it Greenland. And they didn't even put green on the flag.
Oh, yeah.
It's white. The flag is white. And red for Erik the Red, maybe.
Yes. Yeah, maybe.
But Erik rules Greenland for 15 years without incident and grows it as a population and grows it as a settlement. And this is kind of when we get into the second part of our story, which is going to be focused a little bit more on the family of Erik, because after he's been ruling for 14 years or so, we're coming up on the year 1000 CE. And Erik's son, who we know as Leif Erikson, he is about to embark on a quest to, Erik had to sail west from Norway after some killings. He had to sail west from Iceland after some killings. Leif Erikson doesn't kill anybody, but he's going to sail west even further and see what else is out there. And Erik the Red is going to lead the expedition to sail west to see what possible landmasses exist to the west of Greenland. And his original plan is to command this expedition, except unfortunately, while he is triumphantly riding his horse down to the dock to get on the boat, he's kind of an old man at this point. He gets thrown from his horse and he breaks 2 ribs and hurts his shoulder. So he can't make the trip to discover Canada.
No.
He doesn't make it. He's okay. He lives for another year or 2 before he finally gets sick and dies as an older man. But But that's kind of closing the book on Erik. But we're going to pass the torch from Erik on to Leif Erikson. But first, we're going to take a quick commercial break. And when we come back, we are going to tell the story of Leif the Lucky and the expedition to Vinland. So please stick with us. The story of the discovery of Vinland begins much in the same way as the discovery of Greenland. Do you remember Gunnbjorn of Gunnbjorn Scaries? He was going to go visit his dad, and he got blown off course, and he discovered this bleak land of ice and was like, this isn't it. Well, there's a guy named Bjarni Hurjolfsson who wanted to go visit his dad in Greenland. He is coming from Norway. He sails 450 miles from Norway through the North Sea towards Greenland. But no matter how big Greenland looks like it might be on the map, he gets blown off course and he misses Greenland and he sails past it. And he finds this big landmass that's covered with trees and sand and hills and all of this stuff. And he's like, this is a different desolate wasteland than the one I'm looking for. So I think I made a wrong turn. There's no settlement here. So he turns back and lands in Greenland and is like, goes to the court of Erik the Red and says, hey, I was looking for Greenland. I couldn't find it. I found some other land mass out here. There's something west of here, but I don't know what it is. And that's it. That's the end of his story, of Bjarni's story. But in the court of Erik the Red that day, when Bjarni's telling his story, is Erik's oldest son, Leif. And Leif is super pumped up about the idea that there is another massive land formation out there that is covered in trees and sand and all this other stuff. And Leif Erikson is like, so he starts thinking about it. He's like, I've got to know more about this. And when Leif Erikson hears the story for the first time, he's pretty young. And so he starts thinking about it like every day for like 15 years. He's been thinking about this story of Bjarni discovering this new land. And he's like, if I could go there, everything on Greenland's already named after my dad. I got to go find a place where I can name some stuff after myself.
Yeah. And supposedly there are even trees on this new land. So it might actually be a little bit green from time to time.
Yes. And, we had talked about those boats, those Icelandic boats that don't, there's not a lot of trees on Greenland, and there's not a lot of trees on Iceland that are great for making boats. So if you could find a forest with some awesome trees that you could make boats and wooden structures out of, you wouldn't have to import all this stuff from Norway. We could go get it ourselves. That's a good deal. So he starts thinking about this. He finds Bjarni when he gets a little older. When Leif is in turning 20 or so, he finds Bjarni. And then just is like, you got to tell me everything. You have to, where was the storm? What was the temperature? Blah, blah, blah. I want to see your ship logs, everything. He needs to know everything he can find out about this new land. He even, he buys Bjarni's ship, and he finds some of the guys that were working on Bjarni's ship, and he hires them to come work for him. And Leif's kind of the prince of, he's the Jarl's son, so he's a big deal.
Yeah.
And these guys
he is Erik's son. So
he is Erik's son.
He's the son of the guy everything's named after.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he assembles this crew of 30 people and loads them onto Bjarni's old ship. And in the year 1000, which historians love a nice round number for this sort of thing, he decides that he's going to set sail and he's going to try to find this new land. And Erik the Red's like, he's got to give his dad the opportunity to lead. He's like, Dad, you should probably lead this expedition. Dad says, yes, I'm going to do it. Falls off his horse, decides actually, I think maybe I'm too old for this. You should do it. Leif takes over and he sets sail. And this is, one thing that you really need to think about here is what a Viking ship looked like. And this is an open-topped rowboat, basically. This is not the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. This is a Viking ship. And yes, they were very seaworthy and they traveled to all corners of the world, but it's not really a ship that's designed for, freezing wind chills, storms, huge waves, deep ocean sailing.
So it's So just am I picturing this right? It's a boat that's exposed to the elements. Like there's no
Yes.
deck that you can go into to get shelter.
No, nothing like that.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
he goes out there and he's looking for this land that some guy might have seen 15 years ago. He's got no point of reference. He doesn't really know where he's going. So he starts sailing west.
Are we even sure we trust this guy completely?
Right.
You know?
Maybe his
Yeah.
logs were wrong. He was blown off course. He missed Greenland. Like maybe
Yeah.
this guy just doesn't know how to sail, right?
Yeah. Okay. So he's looking for a place that might have
Yes.
trees.
Yes. So he sails out and several days pass and he's starting to get discouraged. They only have a few days left of food. They're going to have to turn back soon if they don't see anything. And he's sailing out in this freezing, miserable, and it's just cold and rainy and miserable and big waves and people are rowing and trying to sail. It's brutal work, hard work. But Leif eventually, after a few days on the sea, on the western horizon, they see land. And, they are off the chart right now. They are off the map. They are here be monsters, edge of the world. You're going to fall into some pit and meet Loki and Heimdall and all of them. And they find it. So they don't encounter any sea monsters. They don't encounter any trouble. And they land triumphantly on what we might think today of as Baffin Island. We think this is maybe where they first landed. And Leif gets out and he surveys the land around him. And it's not the land of forests and sand that he was expecting, was it, Pat?
Oh. So is he thinking, okay, is this just a thing that we're doing to ourselves now? We come back and talk about a land and pretend it looks greener than it is just to, I don't know, troll people into going to discover a barren slab of land with ice and not much else.
So does he name it like Happy Land, Leaf Land, Leaf the Lucky Land?
Well, no. I mean, he could have named it after himself because that seems to be a thing one can do. He names it Helluland, which means slab land, because it was just a slab with nothing else. I mean, it had ice. It could offer ice. Mm-hmm. It could offer rock. That's, if you're really
they got plenty of that on Greenland, though, I think.
Okay, yeah. We have glaciers at home, yeah. Now, this is Leif the Lucky. This does not deter him. He gets in his ship, he turns south, and he keeps exploring. There are lots of inlets and bays, and, there's all sorts of all sorts of places to turn your ship around, and in the ins and outs of the North American coast. He is convinced he's going to find something. So he reaches another place. And this place is actually much nicer. This would correspond to present-day Labrador in Canada. And he names the region Markland. What do you think Markland means, Ben? I mean, because you've researched this.
I know, but I want you to say it.
Okay. So is it because he names it after his best friend whose name is Mark? Does he name it Markland because it marks a goal that he's achieved? No. Markland means woodland because there were woods there.
It's not a very creative naming conventions from this family. Eric's like, it says Eric's Fjord now. And Leif's like, I don't know, slabland, woodland.
Yeah. Now, the thing is, I want to give Leif credit for truth in advertising because there actually was a forest there. Okay, this is not like, Greenland where it's like not actually very green. This had a forest. There were also some sandy beaches. He's, taking a long walk, I don't know.
Maybe they were placeholder names that he put on the map. Slabland here, woodland here. I'll come up with a name for it later.
Okay, that's true. Yeah. Okay, that works. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, what do you think he does? Does he say, oh, hey, let's build a settlement here?
No, he doesn't. So he still thinks there's something else. And he's discovering that there's a lot of land here. And so he keeps heading south because that makes sense if you want to get it out of the slab area of the globe,
Yes.
you want to head south.
Yes. Go
And
treeward.
Yes. So he finally arrives at a place that is like more suited to what he was looking for. Green meadows, a lush maple forest with like great trees for making boats and stuff, beaches, the weather's getting warmer, there's deer, rabbits, there's all kinds of stuff there. And they set aside, they land in this place that is amazing. It is Greenland. It's everything that people were picturing when they were thinking about Greenland. They land there, they get off, they start exploring the area. There's a guy on the crew named Tyrker the German. He heads off to explore a forest and accidentally finds this big patch of wild grapevines. And everybody was so excited that he found grapes that, and here's once again, like Leif being Leif, he's no longer Tyrker the German. He is Tyrker Grape Finder because he's the guy who found the grapes. And
he should get some credit for that. Yes. Tyrker Grape Finder. Yeah.
There you go. And Leif Erikson, he decides, I will name this region Vinland, which means Vineland, because we found grapevines here.
Yes. No exaggeration. They actually did find vines. Yes.
They did. He liked it so much that he decided to stay there for the winter. It was starting to get to be winter. It was not going to be smooth sailing back. The ocean's going to like freeze over. It's not great. So they wintered there. They built some houses, a smithy, a lumber yard. They built a dock to fix their ship. They even built a sauna to relax their muscles, which must have been very tired from rowing through the North Sea.
Okay, so they've got a whole settlement there now.
Yeah. They built, they picked a bunch of grapes and made their own wine, which was not a thing that Vikings were able to do very often. A lot of the places where Vikings lived were too cold for grapes. If Vikings wanted wine, they had to attack France, basically, and plunder it.
Okay, I was going to say,
there was some trading.
Trade, plunder, yeah.
Something. They had to acquire it from Europe somehow.
Yeah.
And,
Okay, so they can make their own wine. They don't have to resort to, burning down a monastery, a Frankish monastery or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. This is better. This is easy. You can just make it yourself. And so Leif goes... spends the winter there and sails back when the weather is starting to get a little better. He returns to Greenland and has these stories of his amazing adventures and all of the stuff he found. But there's some bad news to come along with it. And that bad news is that Erik the Red has died. He got sick and died, as we mentioned earlier. But the problem with that for Leif is that now Leif is the Jarl because he has inherited that title from his father. And the people of Greenland are looking for Leif to lead the settlement. And he can't spend the rest of his days going. He can never go back. He can't take 2 years and sail back to Vinland and see what else is there because he needs to stay here and lead his people. He can't leave them leaderless for 2 years.
He needs to be Jarl. Wow.
He needs to be Jarl. He's got responsibilities. He's got a real job now.
Oh, yeah, he's got a real job. And I suppose if he really wanted to, he could have sort of snuck off in the middle of night and hopped on a boat and gone back to Vinland, but he didn't. He honored his commitments. Yeah,
he did, and he continues to rule Greenland, and Greenland ends up being successful, as we mentioned with Erik. It does do well, and so that's the end of Leif's story. But it doesn't end the story of Vinland, because Leif has some family that can go on this expedition for him and report back to him what they find.
Because they're not busy being Jarl.
Yes. So that's what happens. There are 3 more expeditions that make their way to Vinland. The first one is led by Leif's younger brother, Thorvald, who first lands at Vinland and then heads south to a second site and starts to set up a settlement there. And these Viking explorers, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, Pat, but one thing that Thorvald discovers is that he has arrived in this new place of Vinland and he heads a little bit further south and he finds this new settlement and he has discovered this new world. And, they've discovered the new world 500 years before Christopher Columbus ever set foot on North America. But the problem for Thorvald and the Vikings is that people actually already discovered this land like millennia earlier and were living there and weren't super excited about these Vikings showing up and setting up a settlement and taking over their land and eating all their grapes. And
no.
Yes. And so Thorvald arrives at the second site, and guys come out of the forest and they are wearing war paint, and they have hairstyles that are very different from the Viking hairstyle. They look very different from anybody that the Vikings have encountered before. They have war paint on. They have weapons. They speak a language that the Vikings don't speak. And the Vikings, they don't know what to do, who these people are, what to do with them, or have had no contact with them. This complete alien species, right? Like as far as like UFO coming down to Earth, that's kind of the connection that we have between these two people, right? And so the Vikings call them Skraelings.
Yeah. And Skraeling is a word that in Norse can be used for creatures who are different from us. Honestly, for types of beings you might read about in sagas or hear about in sagas, fairies, elves, any sort of being that you maybe couldn't quite identify or label. Mm-hmm. So, okay, you and I, Ben, know that, okay, these are just humans on both sides, but the Vikings were like, Skrellings. So,
yeah, I don't know what this is. It's Skrellings, right? We think it was probably either Micmac or Beothuk tribe, but we don't know for sure. But one interesting thing that happens here is the Vikings, we've been talking about some killings and raiding and plundering and all the Viking stuff you think of, but Vikings were also, very established traders and merchants. So there was a lot of trade going on in Viking realms. They were trading with everywhere from like Spain to Damascus, right? They were traveling all over the world to trade in Constantinople and in, North Africa and in Europe and Germany. And so they encounter the native population here. And at first, there's an attempt to trade goods. So you have to picture these like, these Scandinavians are here, and then you have the indigenous people, and they decide like, they come out like in a show of force, like, hey, we're here, like, what's going to happen? And there becomes this effort to try and communicate. So maybe there's going to be some trade. They try to talk. They can't communicate. There's a very intense language barrier. And you also have a lot of like a big cultural barrier. There are things that are offensive to a Viking that you cannot expect the people they're encountering to understand, and vice versa as well, right? So they try to talk and trade and work things out, and figure something out. But there's just this huge language and cultural barrier that can't be. They make an effort, but at some point somebody gets annoyed because, you did this thing and that's a huge offense in my culture, but you didn't know. And at some point weapons are drawn and
things escalate.
Yeah, things escalate, and Thorvald is hit with an arrow and he dies. He becomes the first European to die on North American soil, as far as we can tell. His guys pack up and they
So
take
just
off
checking. So we're not considering Greenland part of North America? What? I don't know.
Is Greenland North America?
I don't know. Okay. But okay. He's the first European to die on North American soil that is not Greenland.
Okay. I'm okay with that. So Thorvald is killed, and basically an attempt to trade that goes badly. And his guys leave because they're heavily outnumbered, and they're not warriors. They're explorers and trade and adventurers and colonists and stuff. So they're not there for this. So they head off. The Vikings return a couple years later under the command of a guy named Thorfinn Karlsefni. So Thorfinn is a Norwegian guy. He married Thorvald's widow, and he's returning to make a permanent settlement in Vinland. He brings 100 men and women with him and goes to Leif's first camp in Vinland. So the northerner one, where there wasn't, an incident. And they establish a camp there, and they live there for 3 years.
Oh,
Thorfinn's wife Gudrid, the widow of Thorfinn, she gives birth to their son Snorri while they're in this establishment, and it's thought that he might be the first European kid born in the New World.
okay.
They do encounter indigenous peoples in Vinland as well, and there is a trade established. They trade milk, red cloth, furs, and aside from, but there are still going to be problems, communication problems. They still don't speak the same language. They can maybe try to make things work, but
yeah, you get as far as you can with gestures, but yeah,
right,
that can only get you so far. Yeah,
and I'm sure the Vikings were not super welcome there to create their own establishment and colonize, and they also have to recognize that they're heavily outnumbered by an established culture that lives here, and we don't know where they are and where they're coming from and how many of them there are. So Thorfinn, he's got 100 people. He has no supply lines. He has no reinforcements. He has no easily logistics to deliver things to him from Greenland. He spends 3 years there, but at some point he's like, this is getting a little too dicey and we got to go. So they leave. So the Vikings return again, and this time when they land and they start looking for grapes and stuff, the people that live in this area, they've had it. They've had enough of this, right? There's been this constant tension between the Vikings and the indigenous peoples. And when the Vikings come back and they're going to cut down some trees and they're going to take some grapes, the indigenous peoples attack. So they come out of the forest. They've got the war paint on. They've got slings, axes. They've got tomahawks. They attack. And one person who acquits themselves in a way that gets documented by the Viking sagas is a woman named Freydis, Erik's daughter. And it is the daughter of Erik the Red and the sister of Leif Erikson. And as all of these warriors are coming out of the forest to attack, the Vikings are all there, and they're all armed because they're expecting, they're not sure that whether there's going to be trouble or not, but they're ready for it now. They arrive, and when they are starting to get attacked, the Vikings start to run back to their ships in fear. And Freydis, she is very pregnant at this point, and she decides, like, I've had it. And she's like, we're gonna stand and fight. So she pulls a sword, like one of the Vikings dropped his sword while he was running away, and she picks it up, and she stands at the head of the Viking army, and she yells, quote, "Why do you run, stout men as you are, before these miserable wretches who I thought you would knock down like cattle? If I had weapons, I think I could fight better than any of you." And then she grabs the Vikings keep running. She grabs the sword. She lifts it up. She starts pounding her chest with the sword. And the Skrellings in the saga here, they see this and they're just like angry pregnant woman with a sword slamming it into her chest, screaming at them in Old Norse Viking language. They were just like, I don't know what to do with this. So they stop their attack and they just kind of like back away slowly. And they're like, I don't know what this is, but I'm out. And they leave. And she has kind of single-handedly turned the tide of the battle by just being very Erik the Red, very extremely angry and ready to kill anything. And the Vikings are able to withdraw, and of course they leave. They don't stick around for too long. Freydis later gets in trouble for killing 5 people with an axe in an unrelated dispute over something else while in Vinland.
Okay.
Freydis is not a woman that you would want to mess with. Very serious. Very Erik the Red vibes from her.
Very much so, yes. Yes. Yeah. So after the Freydis incident, do the Greenlanders continue to cultivate their interest in Vinland? Well, the Greenlanders do make a few voyages now and then to Markland, the land of woods, the land of forest, to get timber. But as far as Vinland itself went, after the Freydis mission in 1020, they just abandoned it pretty much. And okay, yes, grapes are nice, but Vinland was actually pretty far away, and they just decided that maybe they were better off not dealing with people who lived there who, as far as they could tell, were hostile, and they honestly didn't know how big the Native American population was. And so they thought, okay, you know what? Let's not bother. It's not worth it. And that was really the last we see of Europeans in that part of North America for another 4 centuries. And over time, Vinland just kind of fizzled away in the Viking imagination. And it got to the point where, as you were saying earlier, Ben, Vinland is referred to in sagas, but because they're sagas, people started assuming that Vinland was just made up. It was just part of the whole saga scene setting.
Right. And, that went on for centuries, that, this was just all made up. Like, there's no way they landed in North America. That's impossible. Not with these little boats and the way they design these things. Like, no way that thing could have made it. Because like you said, Vinland's far away from Greenland. It's as far away as Norway is from Greenland. So that's a considerable distance, hundreds of miles by sea with no obvious point of reference. You're not following a coastline or anything. And you're going through open water in the Arctic. It's cold and it's miserable, and you have this style of boat that's not designed for that. And they're like, oh, this couldn't have been true. And then, in the 1900s, I think in the 1970s, they found Viking houses and artifacts in Newfoundland, Canada, which were carbon dated to 1020 AD, which is the approximate year in the sagas where Freydis lands and has her expedition in Vinland. And and not just, hey, there's a necklace that dates back that far, but hey, here's the floor plan of the longhouse they built.
Yeah.
And here's some pottery, and here's some stuff. Here's pieces of wall that they made. And
because a necklace could, you could just, through trade routes, you trade a necklace, and then a generation later trade it to someone else. And then, if you've got the foundations of buildings and other evidence of settlement, then Yeah, there's a fully excavated archaeological site on Newfoundland now that we believe is Vinland. And we've been doing the drink of the show. And so for me, while we've been recording, my drink was a glass of red wine for Vinland. Okay, in honor of Turkur Grapefinder.
Turkur Grapefinder.
Yeah.
National hero of Greenland and Canada.
Yes. Yeah. And so there, there have been a lot of people who said, oh, how could a Viking ship ever make it across the North Atlantic? Because, Ben, you explained how these ships, the Viking ships, were very different from what we might think of as exploratory ships, huge galleons or whatever that go across the ocean. Is this actually even possible? And in 1893, a Norwegian guy named Magnus Andersen built a full-scale replica of an ancient Viking longboat, and he did it using the same methods and the same tech that would have been available in the year 1000. So the sort of thing that Leif Erikson and his buddies would have used. And he sailed it from Bergen, Norway, all the way to Newfoundland. The trip took about a month, 28 days. And not surprisingly, Andersen had to deal with cold. It was freezing. The seas were dangerous. And despite all that, Andersen and his crew made their way to Newfoundland with almost no damage to their ship. And so, hey, he proved his point. And the intrepid little ship that made this journey through the freezing, dangerous waters was actually displayed at the World's Fair in Chicago later that year.
Yeah. So Magnus Andersen, the most Norwegian name ever.
Yes.
Yeah, he sailed the ship there, and he did it before we had found the site and the carbon-14 dated it. So like he was like, no, I bet they did it. I believe they could have done it because I think I can sail it, and then he did. And then we found that he was right. They did sail it. It's confirmed, and that's Erik the Red. He, sometimes commit some killings, you got to relocate, you do some more killings, you got to relocate again. And that's how we discovered America. That's the story of Greenland.
That is the story. Yes, it's quite
Greenland
a story.
And Vinland, and yeah. And so, that's Erik the Red and Leif Erikson and Freydis Eriksdottir. It's the story of a very violent Viking who became a benevolent ruler who had produced a line of intrepid explorers, and that's the story of Greenland and Vinland and the first Europeans to land on North America. We hope you guys liked listening to the story and hope you found it interesting. If you did, please do like and subscribe and all of that stuff to the show because it does help us out. And Pat, thank you so much for being on the show again. It's always
great to be here.
Like doing these together, and
these are fun.
Yeah, and thanks to you guys for listening. So we will. I guess we're just gonna see you on the next one.
Stay badass.
Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.